Kia ora. Welcome to Women in Data Science Auckland 2020. This year's event is an online series of talks featuring women sharing their stories about their work and career contributions across many industries. WIDS Auckland is an independent event organised by the University of Auckland Faculty of Engineering to coincide with the annual Global Women in Data Science Conference. I'm Kate Milicich, WIDS Ambassador, and I'm delighted to be here to help share some of these inspiring talks. Today's speaker is Rachael Milicich. Rachael is the Deputy Chief Executive and Deputy Government Statistician at Stats NZ, a gold sponsor for WIDS Auckland. Unlocking the value of data and statistics is something that Rachael has been passionate about her whole career. In this time, Rachael has represented New Zealand at the international statistical community, including working as the chair of the United Nations Friends of the Chair group on the fundamental principles for official statistics and open data. She's also a member of the New Zealand Artificial Intelligence Forum Executive Board. In this talk, Rachael will share how making invisible data visible for communities is so important.
Tēnā koutou katoa. So thank you, Kate and Rosalind, for the opportunity to talk to everyone today. The work that I do at Stats NZ, I'm one of the Deputy Government Statisticians and Deputy Chief Executives for Insights and Stats. We've had a great association with Women in Data Science over the years that it's been going, and we're really proud to be a sponsor. And obviously, as a female data leader myself, it's a great pleasure to support the initiative today. Certainly in terms of my career, unlocking the value of data and statistics is something that I've been passionate about my whole career, which has spanned over 20 years. And since joining Stats NZ, I've worked in a number of analytical and leadership roles. My first role was as an economic statistician, so as an analyst, working with economic data. Throughout my career, I've also been lucky enough to represent New Zealand in the international statistical community for a number of years, and more recently was the chair of the United Nations Friends of the Chair group on the fundamental principles of official statistics and open data. I'm also a member of the New Zealand AI Forum Executive Council, Te Kahui Atamai Ia Hiko o Aotearoa, since early 2019. So today, what I wanted to do was talk to you a little bit about data for communities. But before doing that, I would also like to acknowledge that we are still in the midst of a global pandemic, and we've all been touched in some way by what's been happening. And so my thoughts are with everybody as we unite against it. Obviously, with all of the events around the world, thinking about data and communities, it's not surprising that I'm probably going to talk about this in a way that when I was first asked to consider being part of the conference, yeah, I would have given it a different touch. But let's look back before we seek to go forward. So if we just go to slide 2. Next slide. So we've always been looking to understand our communities, to understand the world around us and beyond. We've obviously, as humans, we've been into space, and certainly our search for knowledge is never ending. So thinking about the people around us in our communities, it's natural to want to understand and to want to help them. And the two examples that I've chosen here may be familiar to a number of you. But what they do is that they highlight the importance and the power that data about communities can have. They also at the time were looking to break the accepted wisdom and the conventions of the day that were also present. And so that's an interesting aspect when we think about people in the communities and how we're looking to help people. The first example is Florence Nightingale. So she's seen as the founder of modern nursing. And in one of the pictures you can see there's her infamous pie chart. And this is from 1857, so a long time ago. But essentially she wanted to find a way to show that soldiers were in fact dying from their wounds, were not dying from their wounds on their battlefield, but in fact from unsanitary conditions in their treatment of their wounds. The second example is the physician John Snow, who mapped data from a cholera epidemic in London in 1854. And he wanted to understand obviously why people were dying, but also what the source of the illness was. Cholera at the time was actually thought to be an airborne disease, but this was something that John Snow was not convinced about, and through his work he sought to challenge the wisdom of that, and also to save people's lives. So what do these two examples have in common, and what can we learn from them? Obviously the two problems that were both phenomena that could be observed, but they were really quite hard to understand, and there were clearly aspects of what was happening that weren't readily visible. The collection and the bringing together of data and understanding really was able to make the patterns in the data more visible. Obviously, with Florence Nightingale, it was through the creation of the diagram that she did, the pie chart, and with John Snow, obviously, through the use of maps. And geospatial, the early beginnings of geospatial. What we can also see is that the presentation of that data to convey those insights, it needed to be done in a way that could be easily understood. And in both cases, we can see that. As it transpired, we know now that cholera is a waterborne disease and not an airborne disease. And by looking at the treatment of the soldiers, there was a much better understanding about what the needs were to care for those men. What's interesting about both cases is also the extraordinary lengths that they went to ensure that they were understanding the communities, the people they were working with, and they were trying to help. They were engaging directly with them. Not only to obviously source the data to understand what was going on and to capture that, but also to inform their insights and the evidence that they obviously were later to present in order to challenge the conventional wisdom. Next slide. So if we think about our modern day world, I think we can see that there's definitely a number of parallels. If we take a typical definition of what data science is about, we can see that we continue to want to understand communities, populations of interest, and we need to think about the representativeness of them in our data. We continue to see a focus on how we source data and how we bring that together. We continue to look for patterns in the data and to perform analysis in order to bring those insights out, just in the same way that John Snow and Florence Nightingale were seeking to do. And then we also are looking to present our insights and turn them into knowledge. But I suppose when I thought about this definition and those two examples, one aspect that maybe as we've scaled up what we do in the context of statistics and data science, we've maybe lost sight of how we're engaging directly with communities and how we're understanding them as part of our work. And certainly in reading the stories about Florence Nightingale and John Snow, this was particularly evident that John Snow, for example, interviewed a number of the families and really wanted to understand their stories and what was in behind the map that he had. And I think this is a really important aspect of our work as we work with data and with communities. that we certainly need to think about as part of our modern world. Next slide. So I should just declare I don't actually drive a Volvo, but why did I choose this example? As you know, Volvo has a reputation for making the safest cars, and I saw this. I actually saw this ad and realised that it was obviously promoting the release of open data, releasing their research. So in 1970, the Volvo Traffic Accident Research Team was formed, and they studied and gathered and analysed data from 40,000 cars and 70,000 passengers in the context of understanding what happens to people in accidents. And they've now made their research available. And you know, this was important that they looked at, in terms of the data set that they were looking at, they looked at the impacts on women, men, and children, so all of the people who are involved in accidents. And some of the findings that they had was that women were at higher risk of whiplash than men. Women were more likely to suffer a chest injury in a car crash than men, due to obviously differences in anatomy and strength. But what they also realised was that they needed to learn more about passengers who were pregnant, who are in pregnancy. And it's really through having such an inclusive data set that they were able to change the way that they approach their testing. They use different crash test dummies, they develop different models in order to better understand the impact and channel those things into the design, obviously, of their cars. So, I mean, it's a very compact example, I think, which illustrates the importance of thinking about who is the population, who are the community that you're working with, and making sure that the data is fit for purpose, is inclusive of what it needs to have in order to inform really good design, whether that be a technical design or whether that be in another context, thinking about policy responses. So next slide. So just turning to a little bit more closer to home in terms of where we find ourselves at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, what it has highlighted for a number of countries is that being invisible in the data can be deadly. It definitely matters. But you know, I would argue those gaps have always mattered. But what we can see now is the consequences when they've not been filled, and certainly when those who need to be those who are invisible need to be visible. So from a global perspective, you know, we can see that data can also hide the divisions within our societies, and it can actually further marginalise the poorest and most vulnerable. And these are typically the most invisible people in our data. For example, in Latin American countries, we know that questions about ethnicity and race were only asked for the first time in the latest round of censuses. And this has revealed also that poverty is over twice as high for Afro-descendants in Brazil, 3 times higher in Uruguay, and over 10 percentage points higher in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. These groups also have fewer years of education and are often victims of crime and violence. So until the census round across these countries, this was a huge group of people who were just not identified in official data, and thus their specific situation, you know, is not able to be included in policy decisions. And you know, in our own context in New Zealand, we know that through the pandemic there was a lot of discussion and concerns about our vulnerable communities, and what it highlighted is where we don't have you know, the data that we need still about them. whether that be data about gender and sexual identity, iwi and Māori data, data about Pacific communities, and my colleague Offa will talk more about that in her talk with you, and also people with disabilities. These are all areas that we know that we need to do better, but we can also see the consequences both, when that data is not available and they're not factored, people are not factored into decisions that they need to be. But equally, on a more positive note, in the Volvo example, what can happen when you have good design underpinned by inclusive data. So a number of us are working to develop new ways to capture and fill the gaps that we need, looking at where we can make more investment. We know that we need more to do. But I think the other aspect to this that I just want to make you aware of as well is that it's not just about doing things for these communities, it's also about how we work with them. And, I go back to, the two examples of Florence Nightingale and John Snow. They were very connected with the people that they were trying to help. And we need to be making sure that when we think about sourcing data, the data that we use, the insights that we're gaining, that we are actually working with communities, with the people, the populations of interest. And we need to be mindful of our good intentions as well. Some of the tools that we have been developing and that are available to help us do that include principles for safe and effective data use. There is the Data Protection and Use Policy, Ngā Paehere Tikanga, which is a tool which can aid us working with Māori and iwi to help make good decisions about data, and the Privacy, Human Rights and Ethics Framework are just a few. The intention with with all of that work is really to make sure that we're working with people and we're making good decisions, including in a governance context, about the data that we collect and the insights that we draw from it, and then obviously ensuring that the policy decisions that we make are better informed. One thing that that is also useful to bear in mind is that a number of the communities, and this was the case in those two examples, they're often not large. And so while I am encouraging you to reflect on how you're working with communities, it's also, we just need to be, again, mindful that many of these communities are not always large, and it's very easy for us to overwhelm them, particularly in a government, working in a government context. It's not always helpful if a number of government departments all go out with the best of intentions to meet with the same people. So we do need to be careful about how we go about working together to work with communities. We need to ensure that we're not also in those engagements making assumptions about what their needs are and the value that they might gain from working together, whether that be public, private or non-government sectors. Next slide. So I think just to pull a number of those threads together, I think there is a call to action for us. I do think the role of statisticians and people working in data science is to think about how we make the invisible visible. We've tended to think about that in the context of looking for patterns. If you're doing artificial intelligence, looking for patterns in the data, but we just need to remind ourselves that often those patterns represent people's stories, they represent people and their lived experiences, and so we need to be both advocating for the gaps to be filled as users of data, but also thinking about how we more effectively work with communities and their leaders to ensure that they can both see themselves in the data, but also that our insights and the interpretation that we draw from it are accurate, so that we are actually helping and supporting them. In terms of thinking about data governance, I think this applies really not only at an organisational level, but at a data system level, a wider level. We do need to be ensuring, as I said, that we're identifying gaps, that we're actually looking for them, and creating a plan, an investment plan for filling those. We won't be able to fill all the gaps all at once, we know that, but having a plan and working to that plan can make an enormous difference over time to helping our understanding and ensuring that we get good outcomes. There's also an opportunity for us to collaborate and share data where appropriate, to think about filling gaps. So obviously the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts. And I know this has certainly been a feature of how, both at an international level, but also within countries, the sharing and collaborating of data in order to respond to something like the COVID-19 pandemic has been essential. And then finally, in the New Zealand context, we do need to work with our treaty partners to protect the rights and interests of Māori. And we're just starting really on that journey to think about what other tools, what other ways of working that we need to put in place in order to better give effect to that. Particularly as someone who works in government, that's a key feature of what we're trying to do. So just finally, I think let's put ourselves in the shoes of others, and let's really look to make the invisible visible, so that we can better help and support our communities, which is the focus of our work for a number of us. Thank you.